Good afternoon and welcome to the American Literature Association in Exile. This is the panel being organized and offered by the African American Literature and Culture Society. I do want to mention that next year this conference is going to be held in Chicago, presumably at the usual time, which is Memorial Day weekend. And I want to encourage everyone to contemplate the possibility of proposing a paper for the African American Literature and Culture Society next year, because next year we will be back to multiple sessions. This year, we have a panel consisting of 3 people, and we're going to go in the following order. First, we will hear from our current president, Belinda Waller-Peterson of Moravian College, who will be speaking on the topic of healing and community, Toni K Bambara's literary legacy of health activism. She will be followed by our international component for today, Jean-Philippe Marcoux from Université Laval, who forgives me for my mangling of the French language every time I name his university, in gloriously warm today, Quebec. And finally, we will hear from Sabrina Lapearl Evans, who comes from some place called Penn State University. I think that's in Pennsylvania, if I recall. Haven't been there for over a year, so who knows. And Sabrina's topic today will be Undisputed Dignity, Recovering Anna Julia Cooper's Poetry and Her Reimagination of Black Cultural History. We'll hold the questions to the end, but because we're in this virtual mode, again, all of you should have a Q&A button on your screen, and you can post a question there at any time during the presentations. And then once we've finished all 3, we'll look at those questions and see what kind of answers we can get. So please welcome virtually, Belinda Waller-Peterson.
All right, thank you, Aldon. And thank you for organizing and facilitating this panel. I want to thank my fellow panelists and committee members for so graciously offering your time and your intellectual genius to our panel. And thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. Quick caveat, the essay that I will read today comes from work that I have submitted this semester, and this is actually an encyclopedia, author entry for an encyclopedia, and this is focused on Toni K Bambara. But with this particular piece, I was able to think broadly about her work, specifically thinking about health activism over her corpus. So that is a little bit background on the piece. And I will also say that Toni K Bambara's work, specifically The Salt Eaters, really informs my my work as a scholar, my work as an academic, my background in nursing and moving into academia, specifically her questions about wellness and community. So without further ado, I will jump on in, and I look forward to taking any questions or comments you have at the end. So Toni K Bambara, born Miltonia Merkin Cade, was an activist, writer, editor, documentary filmmaker, and teacher. Bambara's life and work were informed by the movements of the 60s and 70s, both the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, inspired and were informed by corollary artistic movements cultivated across the broad spectrum of Black aesthetic production. Bambara's writing reflects the interstitial connections between both movements, as well as the burgeoning Pan-African movement. Throughout her life, she operated as an artisan and an activist committed to the advancement of Black life, Black culture, and political progress. This essay engages Bambara's major literary works and their development of health activism as a liberatory tool for Black people. Consistent with Bambara's coalition building amongst women and marginalized communities, her literature raises generative questions about and offers innovative pathways toward healing and wholeness for Black people. Raised in Harlem, New York during the 1940s, Bambara's parents immersed her and her brother in creative and political experiences that shaped her definition of the Black community and Black success. Bambara's mother encouraged her artistic aspirations at an early age and empowered Bambara to literally name herself. So as a young child, Bambara renamed herself Toni Cade. In 1970, she added the surname Bambara after discovering the name amongst her grandmother's belongings. Bambara also called herself a cultural worker, a name that reflects her commitment to elevating diverse communities of everyday people. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Theater Arts and English from Queens College in 1959. While pursuing a Master's of Arts degree in American Literature from the City College of New York, Bambara worked as a social worker at the New York Department of Welfare and Rutgers University and Spelman College. She traveled to Cuba and Vietnam, amongst many other countries, to collaborate with and support women's collectives. Bambara published a few short stories prior to editing The Black Woman, an anthology in 1970, and Tales and Stories for Black Folks in 1971. She published her first collection of short stories called Gorilla My Love in 1972, and her second collection, The Seabirds Are Still Alive, followed in 1977. She published her most well-known work, The Salt Eaters, in 1980, and in 1981, The Salt Eaters won the American Book Award. Shortly after, Bambara began working on Those Bones Are Not My Child, a novel that was edited and published in 1999 by her friend and editor, Toni Morrison, after Bambara's death in 1995. Morrison also edited and published Deep Sightings and Rescue Missions, Fiction, Essays, and Conversations in 1996. In 1985, Bambara moved from Atlanta to Philadelphia, where she transitioned into filmmaking. At Scribe Video Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Bambara co-produced with Louis Messiah several documentary film projects, including The Bombing of Osage Avenue and W.E.B. Du Bois in Four Voices. Bambara saw filmmaking as a natural progression of her art and activism. Bambara's body of work reflects her penchant for activism. She develops a distinct political aesthetic across her corpus. According to Linda Holmes, she defined, quote, herself as a Pan-Africanist socialist feminist in the United States, quote, end quote, and, quote, urged Black women to begin deconstructing the myths that lead to their own self-destruction, end quote. So Pan-Africanism is a global cultural and political movement that centers and embraces the common heritage, experiences, artistic production, and political challenges of Black people throughout the African diaspora. Wrestling with and struggling against those political challenges, including the history of slavery, colonialism, apartheid, racial capitalism, and white supremacy, is the vital substance of the Pan-African mission. For Bambara, Pan-Africanism was an essential pillar of her intersectional definition of herself. As a socialist, a feminist, and a Pan-Africanist artist, Bambara's worldview centered women, rejected capitalism, and probed the lived experiences of Black people throughout the diaspora. Bambara clarified her perspective on this intersectional identity in an essay titled On the Issue of Roles in 1970. Quote, "We're so turned around by Western models, we don't even know how to raise the correct question. But raise them we must if we are to fashion a natural sense of self, if we are to develop harmonious relationships with each other. What are we talking about when we speak of revolution, if not a free society made up of whole individuals," end quote. For Bambara, Pan-Africanism, socialism, and feminism reflect a nexus of ideologies and identities through which she was able to establish models in her fiction and in her activism that would in turn cultivate the harmonious alliances required to sustain the societal revolution that would result in true liberation for Black people all over the world. Toni K Bambara believed in the complexity of Black identity and reflected that complexity in and through her work. According to Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, quote, "Her writing is woven, aware of its music, its overlapping waves of scenic action, so clearly on its way, like a magnet collecting details in its wake, each of which is essential to the final effect," end quote. Morrison's poetic description of the forms of Bambara's writing also powerfully reflect the social, political, and cultural content of Bambara's novels and collections of short stories. So Bambara's body of work emphasizes activism in ways that center Black people, people of color, and women. Activism, as understood and articulated by Bambara, includes health activism. Health, wellness, and what constitutes wholeness emerge as primary concerns in the collected essays in The Black Woman, the short stories in Gorilla My Love and the Seabirds Are Still Alive, the community health center setting of The Salt Eaters, and in the pages of Those Bones Are Not My Child. For Bambara, health is our right. Note well here that health, not healthcare, is what Bambara claims as a human right, and in so doing, she cultivates characters and fictional experiences in literature that ruminate on the critical issues at stake in terms of health and wellness for Black people and Black women especially. The Community Health Center wall in Bambara's first novel, The Salt Eaters, reads, "Health is our right." This sign is at once a declarative statement, an assertion of agency in self, an affirmation of what is, not what is due or being asked. The "Health is our right" sign is a reminder that Black people in the community have a right to access all of the resources that constitute health. This moves beyond medicine, doctors, and treatment into the more proactive provenance of nutrition, exercise, and the ongoing struggle to dismantle the systems of racism and economic exploitation that overdetermine health and life expectancy for Black people. Health is our right underscores what is already a given or what should already be a given. Health is our right states that broader definitions of health, the resources that constitute health, the living conditions that support health, etc., are always already understood as our rights. For Bambara, these are inalienable rights embedded in what it means to be human. Much like the healthcare disparities and the cultural incompetency in medical diagnoses, Bambara finds that we regularly and systematically ask the wrong questions. Bambara challenges her readers to ask the right questions, generative questions that highlight the health concerns of Black women, children, men, and Black communities. Asking the right questions allows individuals and their communities to advocate for themselves and others in meaningful and impactful ways. Bambara signals the declaration that health is our right throughout her body of literature. She defines health as including the physical sense of the body, the spirit of Black communities, the collective political action of women, and the financial well-being of individuals and their communities. Through her work and writing, Bambara suggests that health is inextricably woven into how Black people create, embrace, and or reject definitions of what it means to exist in the world as a Black person. Bambara's first short story collection, Gorilla My Love, is comprised of 15 short stories that meditate on childhood, betrayals, love, and womanhood. The collection considers the constitution of community by focusing on the interior desire of Black girls and women. While these stories wrestle with trauma and the challenges faced by oppressed people at various intersections of subjectivity and identity, several young girls emerge in bold defiance of gendered norms and societal expectations. Their examples demonstrate what is possible for Black communities when the health and wellness of Black girls and women is centered. In Raymond's Run, young Hazel Park articulates a confident sense of self that is strengthened in her dominance as a runner and commitment to her disabled older brother. Hazel embodies the caring ethic that Bambara suggested could, quote, push against the synthetic conflicts that white society orchestrates in its interests, not ours, end quote. The young women in the Johnson Girls also affirm a caring ethic that speaks to some of the ways in which women offer themselves to one another as resources. Gathered in Inez's bedroom, the young women act as her co-conspirators, advisors, and confidants as they assess the status of her relationship and discuss the nature of being women. Whether familial or sisters by choice, Gorilla reveals that collectives of women can create and normalize self-affirming spaces where they are centered, healthy, and whole, even as they take on the pressures of living in a world of systemic racial and gender oppression. Bambara's second collection of stories, The Seabirds Are Still Alive, highlights political action, police brutality, tensions in relationships, exile and return, beginnings and endings. Girls, young women, and maternal figures continue to populate the intimate spaces of the stories. They embody contradictory ideas of girlhood, exercise bold declarations of girlhood, embrace blossoming womanhood, and settle into a seasoned, experienced womanhood. They do this alongside tumultuous and violent events that happen in their homes, communities, and the world. Similar to Gorilla, this collection takes up questions of agency and wholeness. However, Seabird situates those questions within communities that are actively under siege, trapped in the memories of being set upon by agents of the government, and at times determined to organize and educate themselves in the face of racial oppression. In many instances, the health of the community hinges on smaller collectives, cultural and community centers, mentoring groups, women's groups, etc., established to advocate and provide support and resources for the larger communal whole. What emerges throughout Seabirds is a depiction of communities in crisis as a result of deteriorating health conditions caused by greedy, predatory organizations and racist, sexist institutions. These conditions, sorry, I'm gonna pause for the motorcycle to go by. These conditions include lack of healthy food options because members of the community no longer own their own land, unsafe living conditions as a result of targeted police violence and disinvestment in community infrastructure. Individual acts of selfishness or carelessness invite in the opportunists to take advantage of the inexperienced and unrepresented members of the community. And at other times, it is the crushing relentlessness of capitalism, government bureaucracy, and white supremacy that Bambara exposes in her second novel, Those Bones Are Not My Child. But always, it negatively impacts the community to be healthy, the community's ability to be healthy, to thrive, and to live. Bambara foregrounds the question of what constitutes health and wellness in the Salt Eaters and maps out a world in which the state of one person's health resonates beyond her own community. The novel opens with a question that becomes a refrain adapted throughout the text. Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? The primary story unfolds over the course of a single day and situates two Black women, one a healer, the other an activist, at its center. Velma, having suffered a mental health crisis and attempted suicide, ends up in the community infirmary where she finds herself sitting on a stool opposite Minnie, who poses the question. For Velma, health hinges in part on acknowledging and accepting her spiritual inheritance while also managing her activist work. Velma is the primary example of the danger of sacrificing one's own health at the altar of productivity, advocacy, and/or the demands that a community makes on its activists. The pressing issue of the novel is to heal Velma. Her healing is enmeshed in the health and healing of the other characters in the narrative. The definition of heal is explored and expanded by the medical practitioners and non-traditional healers. Bambara sets aside modern medical knowledge and practice as a primary course of treatment. The treatment required for Velma to be well is beyond the expertise of modern medicine. So the doctors can attend to the physical body, stitching the cuts on her wrists, but they cannot address the root cause of her illness. So through the reiteration of Minnie's question, the cost of wellness and wholeness becomes clear. Velma must identify past traumas and decide that she wants to be well, to be healed and whole. This process requires the support of her community, which constitutes an additional level of healing that is communal and distinct from allopathic medicine. In the novel, this type of communal support manifests as elders and spiritually rooted community members sitting in a circle around Velma and Minnie. I think they're making a loop around the block, I'm sorry. They assist in the healing ceremony by praying, meditating, humming, and directing positive energy towards the women. Velma's location at the novel's center serves as an anchor for the other characters who are also facing physical and psychic challenges. They also require the intervention of neighbors and friends. The stories of other characters oscillate between the past and the present, at times creating a sense of confusion and chaos that mirrors Velma's own inability to grasp her present condition or care for herself. The novel imagines healing in a way that requires community, medical practitioners, and healers to work in community with one another. Health is our right, but this assertion works against the long-standing attitudes of perseverance and long-suffering that Bambara and other Black writers acknowledge. The kinds of questions the Salt Eaters forwards pose constructive opportunities for activists, artists, and thinkers to consider relevant ideas for the pathway forward in health and wellness for Black communities. Those Bones Are Not My Child immerses the reader in the Atlanta kidnappings and grisly murders of the children that occurred from 1979 to 1981. Bambara, who lived in Atlanta with her daughter during this horrific time, collected newspaper articles related to the cases and filled notebooks with information she gathered from task forces, and other community-led groups. Bambara's journals and investigative work became the foundation for Bones, whose working title was If Blessing Comes. Bones follows a young Black mother, Marsala Sala Spencer, whose son disappears at the beginning of the novel. Zala, who has 2 younger children, is overwhelmed by the lack of access to accurate information and the law enforcement and investigative bureaucracies that force her to spend time tracking down leads and relying on press conferences for updates on the cases. According to Bambara, when writing Bones, she was asking, quote, "Do we understand what it means when you buy into the official version of things?" End quote. The question challenges readers to consider how official language, as Morrison refers to it in her 1993 Nobel Prize acceptance lecture, inflicts violence on marginalized communities that have already been victimized. In Bones, the violence of the official version of the Atlanta child murders comes as omissions, denials, obfuscation, and character assassination as the victims of crime are blamed for their own victimization. This blaming extends to the community that struggles to protect itself from the exact violence perpetuated and sustained by inaccurate reporting, the outcome of which erodes the mental, physical, and spiritual health of individuals within the community. The thematics of Toni K Bambara's literary work pose challenging questions and cultivate compelling characters designed to probe the complexities of health and wellness as civil and human rights, particularly in the Black and African American community. Bambara grasps the individual experience through her characters and the community experiences in her characters' worlds. She reflects on the health of her community through her powerful prose and compelling subject matter to assert that individual health and wellness, health, and what constitutes wholeness is inclusive of and in many ways dependent on the health of the overall community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Belinda. By the way, out here in Santa Barbara, my internet connection is sometimes a little unstable. So if I freeze up, just go on, I'll be back. Okay. Next, we'll hear from Jean-Philippe Marcoux in Quebec.
Thank you, Aldon. Thank you for organizing the panel. Thank you, Belinda, for your work and leadership of the Society for the last 2 years. And thank you, Sabrina, for joining us on the panel today. It's really wonderful to be here despite the tumult of the last year. In the seminal essay, The Changing Same, Amiri Baraka writes, quote, "Blues is the deepest expression of memory, experience, re-feeling. It is the racial memory," end of quote. What is striking in Baraka's definition is how, despite some cultural nationalists' view on blues as antiquated sounds of passive acceptance, the poet-critic continues to perceive the music as cultural memory, as lived experiences expressed lyrically responding to the predicament of being Black in a white-dominated world. As experiential music and cultural mnemonic, blues enacts a continuum that iterative performances of a culturally coded counter-discourse will forward. Riffing on Baraka's ideas, Larry Neal notes, quote, "The ethos of the blues is the musical manifestation of one's individual, cultural experiences in Afro-America with which members of the Black community can identify," end quote. Neal considers each personal ritualization of the larger ethos in terms of its ability to recondition the responsive dimension of the communal predicament. Neal further places the blues ritual in an antiphonal dynamic that reinvokes the ontological link with Africa. In this, he not only invoked Jan-Heinz Jan's Muntu, African culture in the Western world, first published in English in 1961, but also, and perhaps more forcefully, Jan's Neo-African Literature, A History of Black Writing, published in 1968, around the same time as Neal and Baraka's seminal Blackfire. In fact, Jan exerted considerable influence on the Pan-African politics that Neil would deploy in his work. As James Smethers notes, the Muntu Collective, Philadelphia-based group of intellectuals that included Neil, James T. Stewart, and others, was named after Jan's work. Peniel Joseph remembers a meeting with Neil during which the latter pointed to Jan's Muntu as primary contextual reading on the Black Arts movement. Neil Gunn Anadolu Okur studies at length the impact of Jan's theorization of Nommo on Black arts artists and thinkers, especially in terms of claiming Africanisms for the purpose of conceptualizing a Black-centered discursive platform. Alluding to the concept of Nommo, Okur writes, quote, "Nommo's transformative power is functional, collective, and committed. The artist or the poet speaks to the community and for the community. His, her art is therefore functional, responsible, and collective. Collectivity is not meant to be anti-individualistic. It is, rather, the ability to reach the collective consciousness of the people." Jan's emphasis on the collective dimension of Nommo is fundamental. It points to the necessity of what Fahamisha Brown calls performing the word. Performing Nommo is both individual and collective. The artist attempts to mine the full potential of his, her own cultural consciousness at the same time as he tries to elevate the collective consciousness of the people. This practice is evocative of African antiphony, for which Jan draws parallels with the blues. For Jan, the blues ethos is a stylization of the African worldview. He sees a direct link between African antiphony, especially in the tradition of praise song, and the ritualized processuality of blues. Jan writes, quote, "In contrast to the life force, which is exercise, Nommo, there is Magara, the life force which one possesses, which one wants to increase, and which can be diminished by the influence of others. Anyone whose Magara diminished tries to reinforce it, to restore its full life force. The result in North America is the blues, which expresses nothing else but these attitudes. It demonstrates the attitude causes by the loss of life force and leading to the gaining of life force," end of quote. What Jan underlines in this passage is the idea of Magara as rhetorical agency, as discursive potential to respond to the challenges of an intolerant and prejudiced society. Tony Bolden, in The Important Afro Blue, perceives a similar rhetorical quality in the blues. He argues that, quote, "Like blues musicians, blues poets use blues forms to counter misrepresentation, describing and responding to experiences in styles that challenge conventional definitions of poetry, resisting ideological domination," end of quote. That the agent of rhetorical resistance is the blues signals the fundamentality of stylized ritualizations to and in Black life. Following Jan's and Bolden's respective ideas, it is possible to state that ritualization of the blues ethos and poetry work toward the reclamation of both cultural identity and life force, both the individuals and the communities Magaras. Recuperating Neil's and Jan's respective conceptualization of the blues ethos, Kalamu Yasalam proposes a broader paradigm. He extends definitions of the blues ethos by considering how it tends to, quote, "underwrite a larger blues aesthetic that manifests itself in everything done, not just the music," end of quote. The poetry of Tom Dent unpacks the many ways in which the blues ethos is performed and ritualized in sports, music, politics, activism, and other types of enactments and behaviors, forming in the process a larger blues aesthetics. His blues poetry, especially that collected in Magnolia Street and Blue Lights and River Songs, is concerned with reparation of the cultural fabric of African American life, of the reclamation of Magara. That is, his verse revealed the aestheticization of the blues ethos by engaging personal, historical, and cultural consciousness as well as Magaras. Acknowledging that tears in the fabric have had long-lasting effects on cultural identity and memory, Dent proposes to return to blues as a way of investigating the sources of those ruptures in the continuum of Black ontological expressivity. Essentially, then, Dent's poetry posits the blues aesthetic process in which stylization, which according to Yasalaham, demonstrates the individual variation in the collective statement. An assessment and ritualization of personal experience within the continuum of Black histories. Articulated as antiphonal practice, the stylization of the blues process, Yasalam argues, is motivically linked with, calls for, and responses to recuperative and reinscriptive performances of vernacular ancestry. That Dent would choose New Orleans as experiential site of Nommo, Magara, and the blues ethos is not incidental. When Dent returned home to New Orleans after his New York experience with Umbra, he quickly aligned with the Free Southern Theater, another collective whose connected writing group, Black Art South, began publishing its own journal, mostly dedicated, much like Umbra magazine, to poetry. Entitled initially Echoes from the Gumbo, the journal changed its name to Nkombo, which, as Salinas notes, is the Bantu word that is the origin of the English word gumbo. End of quote. Published between 1968 and 1974, the journal showed the constant influence of Jan's Pan-African cultural politics. Jan promoted Bantu words and concepts in Muntu. Moreover, it is possible to see how Dent reinvests and reinvestigates the correlations that Jan established in between traditional African cultures and neo-African cultures through his theorization of New Orleans as a gumbo space of fertile and cross-pollinating intercultural encounters. For instance, in the prosodic postscript to Magnolia Street, entitled Report from New Orleans, Dent identifies the city as neo-African locus of the blues ethos. In the introductory notes to his interview with Dent, Jerry Ward contends that Dent saw New Orleans as quote unquote a matrix for creativity, perhaps best represented by the Congo Square Writers Union, which Dent founded and saw as the descendant of Free Southern Theater. In Dent's poems, the blues ethos facilitates and sustains those encounters. In turn, the poetry illuminates the potential of blues spaces to generate or increase Magara. In essence, the poetry forges a dialogue between the artist and the city, between the individual and the collective, between Neo-Africa embodied by New Orleans and Africa as both ancestral land and cultural memory. The long poem Return to English from Magnolia Street is a potent example of Dent's stylization of the blues ethos. In it, Dent historicizes the arrival of a slave ship in what was to become New Orleans under, and I'm going to use my French here, Sœur de Bienville, Jean-Baptiste Lemoine. He also dramatizes the plight of enslaved men and women chained to the tanks, the awls of the boat, quote, us in the hall. Chained, confused, torn in the hall, the music of our ruptured memory, clashing with the grating roar of chains, end of quote. Against the dialectical confusion and the dehumanizing realization that they are embarking on a quote unquote neo-European forced journey, the self-asserting us deploys their songs as means of asserting the violence of uprooting. Taken hostage and redefined as subhuman possessions, the enslaved process their situation through the musics of ruptured memory, the African antiphonal rituals used to organize society on the African continent, now refigured to adapt to the new conditions. As slavery further develops into an institution necessitating the influx of more slaves, the African carryovers intermix with the music of chains, thereby moving toward an African-American music expressive of the Black experience in the figurative hall of humanity. Here, Dent also points to the fact that Black American music is a product of the rupture with the motherland. As a result of Black resilience and resistance to the conditions of rupture, the African cultural memory merged with the American experience to form a new paradigmatic and idiomatic culture, a Black aesthetic that instead of erasing the intermeshed Black histories, cross-fertilize antiphonal rituals with the roar of slave culture. Interestingly, Dent affirms this African-American resolve through the use of us in conjunction with our, signaling that the musical rituals enslaved Africans performed to exorcise the demons of their predicament was grounded in a profound need for group affirmation. Later in the poem, Dent returns to this idea, quote, our songs, our shouts, our forgotten lives echo through this valley, strong man screaming from the dungeon of the new hall. The repetition of us and our reinforces the notion of artistic self-determination through which enslaved men and women attempted to make sense of their lives while trying not to capitulate under the crushing weight of the plantation's violence and misrepresentation of Blackness, the apparatus of the new hall. Dent emphasizes the functionality of the new culture that emerged from enslavement, a culture in which songs play the twine roles of communicative medium and performance as resistance. He points to how enslaved Africans encoded their songs in ways the planter or the overseer could not decode. As what David Grundy calls indexes of memory, music and music making became languages, languages that can interrogate the peculiar institution, and metacultural rituals that spoke truth in ways that the unknowing oppressor could not fathom, and which prevented, quote, parish churchyard hangings, end of quote, because of impudent voicings. Dent writes, quote, those songs were our only way of saying what we could not afford to say. Those songs were our only understanding of what we could not comprehend. Why were we brought here? Why were we brought here to these oppressive plantations? How did we end up being the ones? End of quote. The questions that make music rituals necessary and purgative will eventually form the basis of the blues ethos. The aestheticization of the conditions on the plantation allowed an enslaved people to find solace and momentary respite through their stylized responses to their oppressions, to their oppressors and forms of oppression, Dent continues, we made music that absorbed all that music that floated on the wings of memory, on the wings of tomorrow's travail, through the muggy Saturday night from the shacks behind the tracks. We, doomed to Aldon, attained elegance in ragged attire, end of quote. The elegance of an enslaved people, according to Dent, lies in the ability to transform demonizing experiences into deeply affecting cultural expressions of communal strength, expressions drawn from the well of cultural memory, used to transcend the limitations of what lies ahead, and as such provide hope and beauty against Aldon. The ritualistic attainment of elegance suggests a transformative journey evoked to defeat tropes of subhumanity and coercive politics of misrepresentation. In the last stanza of the poem, Dent also claims the possibility of a post-slavery mindset, one that contains the last remnants of a distant past and the inerasable experience of the plantation, as well as the anticipation of a new Black militancy encoded in music. Quote, there is a song the old griot sings about the uprooting of European markers and the planting of baobab trees. And we hear it now winding around us, caressing us with its ripples of kora notes. It is a tune we have heard many times, containing notes we do not now know, but pleasing, growing stronger now, stronger, end of quote. The rootedness in the past, contained in the allusions to the baobab trees, and the griot as historian, or Muntu, narrating genealogies while playing the kora, invokes a revolution of the enslaved's consciousness. The slave culture was reinvested African carryovers, and its anticipated future in the postbellum blues provides means to contest the history of European markers on Blackness. Negating its effects does not mean erasing its history. The music growing stronger now may just uproot the rhizomic discourse of white supremacy. And if the old griot establishes the term of the testimonial chain, Dent, as blues poet and descendant, takes up the mantle of rehistoricizing the functionality of slave songs in developing a continuum of resilient voices determined to find an outlet for their frustrations and their hopes. Here the blues artist trades the kora for the guitar or the pen. Likewise, Dent subsumes the poetic translation of the Black vernacular ethos in the griot's oral history. After all, as Yasalam writes, Dent, after returning to New Orleans, became, quote, a true griot, end of quote. Return to English Turn also deploys New Orleans as a complex cultural space for the lionization of the Black aestheticians and blues performers especially. As Dent writes in the poem for Walt Washington, a homage to New Orleans mainstay Walter Wolfman Washington, who comes from a tradition of Black guitarists who refigured the pentatonic and the octatonic scales. Quote, we Black blues singers, we blacken the chords. With shots of blue, we Black blues singers, end of quote. The dialogue between Black blues singers and the cultural legacies their song carry enacts an antiphonal correspondence between history and vernacular performativity, between past and present means of actualizing Black aesthetics. In that sense, the blackening of the chords suggests the resilience of African Americans trying to negotiate through artistry their ontological erasure. It is Washington's way of saying something through the blues. In the essay, Black Music in New Orleans, Some Thoughts, and Dent states that, quote, the blues is the most subtle, the most complex, the most ritualistic of Black musical forms. There's no way to describe a great blues musician other than to say he knows something, than to listen. Walter Washington knows something, end of quote. Honoring Wolfman Washington becomes an occasion to celebrate New Orleans as one of the low-key of Black vernacular culture, especially the blues. For Dent, reclaiming New Orleans as home does not mean a nostalgic turn to what Smethurst calls a museum of the Black South. Instead, Dent conceptualizes the return home as a journey back to the literary etymology of the blues aesthetic, a journey Dent had begun in the Lower East Side of New York before and during the Umbra experience. Therefore, when in the aforementioned poem on Washington, Dent writes, "New Orleans is an easy town to dance the blues in, everybody, tune your mind." He interlinks historical and cultural consciousness. New Orleans is re-semiotized as a necessary site of cultural reclamation that Dent must reinvestigate, for it contains the blues memory of African Americans. To tune your mind becomes a call to awake one's Black consciousness to the cultural heritage of New Orleans, one that continues to express the particular experiential tensions conflated in the blues ethos. On this point, in the preface to Magnolia Street, Dent writes, quotes, "I began to conceive of Black New Orleans in terms of African remnants, which provided more extraordinary depth to its living memories. New Orleans as particularly strong outpost of the African diaspora through its cultural continuum of dance, music, cooking, speech, and drumming," end of quote. Grundy accurately sees this in this practice, quote, "imperative to document forgotten figures," end of quote, as a corrective to practice of reclamation that was central already to Umbra. Instead of a fossilized version of the city, Dent posits a fluid, expansive New Orleans as a living archive and encyclopedic memory of the Black experience, constantly refigured and refashioned through various performances to adapt to the demands of the time. Dent's sounding of New Orleans encapsulates the rhythms of Black life. New Orleans is music, because it offers a vast array of ritualistic means of confronting a vexed existence. As such, New Orleans both embeds and embodies the cultural continuum African Americans have used since enslavement to address and historicize their plight. For Dent, Nuo, his term, contains the spirit of Black people. The city is a living document of both the awful tear in the fabric of Black ontology and the musical rituals that have attempted to repair it. New O is a blues city in dance poetry, a blues city that performs Nommo for its Black communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Philippe. Now I'm going to alert everybody, we're trying a bit of an experiment here. Sabrina is going to be speaking, and I am going to be trying to run her PowerPoint from my end. We're going to see if that works. Does everybody now see a slide on the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Sabrina, I don't know how big your picture is going to be while you're speaking, but at least we can see your slides. Okay, Sabrina Evans, thank you.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, or I guess good morning, depending on where you're located. I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Nielsen for organizing this panel, and my fellow panelists, Belinda and Jean-Philippe. It is such a pleasure and an inspiration to be on a panel with you both, and it will definitely be hard to follow such wonderful and rich presentations, but I will attempt to do so. So if you can go to the next slide. Perfect. Anna Julia Cooper, born in 1858, is often best known for her foundational Black feminist text, A Voice from the South by a Black Woman from the South, which was published in 1892. A Voice from the South included a series of essays and speeches that centered Cooper's articulation of a Black woman's standpoint on issues impacting the Black community and issues within the predominantly white women's movement. Cooper asserted that, quote, "only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me," end quote. Thus, centering the critical role Black women would play in Black liberation, equality, and progress. Cooper's conceptualization of undisputed dignity meant acknowledging and supporting the specific interventions, intellectual contributions, and activism of Black women as essential to Black progress, and a refusal to accept any disrespect or dispersions cast against their character. Cooper embodied undisputed dignity through her career as a prolific writer, educator, and Black feminist activist, working well beyond 1892 to educate Black youth and working Black adults, as well as preserving her intellectual contributions and those of other Black women who she was in community with. She continued to advocate for herself and others up until her passing in 1964 at the age of 105 years old. In this slide, you see her in her doctoral regalia. She was the fourth African-American woman to receive a doctoral degree, and she did so when she was 67 years old, attending and receiving a PhD in philosophy from the University of Paris-Sorbonne. For this presentation, I will be focusing on an aspect of Cooper's writing that is not often engaged with as much as her essays and speeches, her poetry. Like many 19th century Black intellectual women and organizers, Cooper wrote in multiple genres, submitting newspaper and magazine articles, as well as writing plays and poems. Her poetry, which has never been published as far as I can tell, reveals her efforts to reimagine Black history, to memorialize and honor the Black women who inspired her, and to center the genealogies of Black mothers and other mothers who have helped protect and sustain their Black children. I will specifically be focusing on 3 of Cooper's poems: Simon of Serene, The Black Madonna of Chartres, France, and Aunt Charlotte. Next slide. I was able to access these poems through my work with the Anna Julia Cooper Digital Project, which is a partnership between Howard University and Penn State University, brought about through the efforts of Dr. Shirley Moody Turner from Penn State and Dr. Lopez Matthews at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard. Next slide, please. The Anna Julia Cooper Digital Project successfully digitized Anna Julia Cooper's papers at Howard and was followed by Douglas Day 2020 Transcribe Cooper, a crowdsourced transcription event that involved the participation of multiple universities, libraries, and local community members in transcribing Cooper's papers to make them more searchable and accessible to researchers. Projects like the Anna Julia Cooper Digital Project and Douglas Day are essential to recovering fuller records of 19th century Black women's intellectual thought and the personal and professional networks that sustain their work. It was through my own participation as a research assistant for the Anna Julia Cooper Digital Project and as the project manager for Douglas Day 2020 that I was able to access and engage with Cooper's poetry and put it into conversation with her larger body of work. Next slide, please. I'd like to begin with Cooper's poem, Simon of Serene, which you will see handwritten here by Cooper, and which is, along with the other poems I discuss, pulled from her papers at Howard. Simon of Serene retells the biblical story of the man who helped carry Jesus' cross prior to his crucifixion. Cooper reimagines Simon of Serene as a Black man and retells the story in order to reflect Black people's historical and continued oppression. For the purposes of this presentation, I have included a transcribed excerpt from the poem. Next slide, please. Given Cooper's many years teaching at M Street High School, which was later renamed Dunbar High School in DC, as well as at Frelinghuysen University, which is a school that she founded for working Black adults also in DC, this poem's reimagination of Simon of Serene's story helps to refute a long history of white slave owners and white supremacists using the Bible to justify slavery and Black inferiority. Cooper instead utilizes Simon of Serene to indict them for their role in all the, quote, petty nothings that keeps mankind apart. The lines, quote, the Negro's willing shoulder beneath the cross was thrust, the burden and the bearer no more shall be accursed, end quote, puts Simon the Black man in relationship to Jesus, both sharing the burden and bearing the weight of sin and oppression. Quote, no more shall be accursed, end quote, recalls white supremacist biblical interpretations that believe that Blackness was a curse and marked Black people as slaves or inferior. In rewriting or removing this curse or burden, Cooper rejects that future for her students, for her readers, and for the Black community that she engaged with. Next slide, please. In a letter to her friend Anna Margaret Jackson, a Quaker reformist in New York who spoke out against slavery and racism and supported the education of Black youth, Cooper notes that she has enclosed a copy of her poem, Simon of Serene, asking for Jackson's opinion and her aid in potentially publishing it in the Outlook, a weekly magazine published in New York City that ran from 1870 to 1935, and printed material on religious, political, and social issues. Cooper writes, quote, "Please advise me. I'm getting a photograph made of a beautiful church window in Washington representing Simon as a Black man bearing the cross. I would like to make a white Easter booklet with illustration to sell afterwards. If this does not weary you, I have written a few others which I shall have typewritten and submit to your criticism," end quote. Cooper's intention to disseminate her poem through print publications, as well as through an Easter booklet, highlights her determination to circulate reimagined Black histories that rejected depictions of Black people as inferior. By placing her poem side by side with visual representations of biblical figures as Black, Cooper, in line with her dedication to education, sought to encourage Black youth and Black communities to see themselves in biblical stories in more positive and affirming ways. As such, it is important to recover Cooper's poem as part of a history, particularly in the 20th century, of African American communities seeing Simon of Serene as signifying Blackness and African identity. For instance, we might consider putting Cooper's poetry in conversation with County Cullen's 1925 poem, Simon the Cyrenian Speaks, which depicts Simon of Serene as being initially reluctant to, quote, "bear his cross upon my back. He only seeks to place it there because my skin is Black." Comparatively, Cooper's Simon is more hopeful for what his actions might mean for future Black generations, as seen in the lines, quote, "and they who love the Lord someday shall call me brother in memory of his word," end quote. Cooper's poem exhibits undisputed dignity by considering how this biblical history predicts the inevitability of the end of Black people's oppression and their own agency in bringing about their equality. I'd now like to turn to another religious figure that Cooper highlights in her poetry, the Black Madonna. Next slide, please. So here is that poem, again handwritten by Cooper. Her poem, The Black Madonna, Charte de France, was likely inspired by her own travels to France when she was studying to get her PhD from the Sorbonne, eventually becoming the fourth Black woman from the United States to get a doctoral degree. The Black Madonna's name stems from the coloration of the statue of the Virgin Mary and her child that is located at the Chartres Cathedral, which has depicted them with darker skin for centuries. Like with Simon of Serene, Cooper was inspired by visual representations of biblical figures as Black, seeing Simon of Serene as Black in a church window in Washington, D.C., and the Black Madonna in Charte de France. Next slide, please. So this is the transcribed poem in its entirety. Cooper's poem portrays the Black Madonna as a symbol of Black motherhood, serving as anchors and beacons of hope to their children, dealing with, quote, "all the worries and frets, the hurts and backsets of the proud pushing world," end quote. Her emphasis on the imagery of the Black mother as anchor and beacon binds her idealization of Black mother's faith with their endurance, which, quote, "sheds such beams of tenderness from the sad, patient eyes, with the soft arms that pillows life's ecstasies and the wonderful heart of that mother," quote. The "God knows" and "honey, he cares" dialogue within the poem represent motherly colloquialisms that reassure the Black mother's children that the barriers or frustrations they face are recognized and that God's divine recognition would provide a source of comfort. Next slide. So this is a visual representation of the Black Madonna as it appeared for many centuries, in which thousands of people throughout history, including Cooper, made pilgrimages to and were inspired by. The Black Madonna served as a Black cultural symbol to many of its Black diasporic visitors who had rarely seen depictions of the Virgin Mary or Jesus as Black or with darkened skin, countering white supremacist interpretations of Black people, again, as being destined to be enslaved or inferior. Cooper was so inspired by viewing the Black Madonna that she wrote a poem in dedication to Black mothers. The Black Madonna's role as symbol and inspiration to many has, unfortunately, recently been erased. A 2017 New York Times article by Benjamin Rahm entitled "A Controversial Restoration That Wipes Away the Past" in the Chartres Cathedral, a decision had been made to remove the, and this is a quote, "the unsightly coding," end quote, from the figures as part of the cathedral's restoration project, thus whitening the Black Madonna. Next slide. Next slide. There's the lag. Oh, perfect. Wait, no, sorry, go to the previous one. It was lagging on my screen. Sorry about that. It'll be back to the picture of like the two Black Madonnas side by side, sorry. Slide 11. Perfect. Thank you. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Great. So here are the changes to the statue shown alongside the original. This decision has astounded many visitors who have for centuries made pilgrimages to the cathedral precisely because of its unique portrayal of the Virgin Mary and her child as Black. Now the Black Madonna is no more than a cultural memory. The subject of Cooper's poem no longer has a physical, visual representation, the cathedral authorities seeing the Black skin as nothing more than built-up grime and soot that needed to be cleaned, rather than as an origin story of Black motherhood that Cooper sought to capture in her poem. Next slide. All right, so the last poem I'd like to discuss is Cooper's poem entitled Aunt Charlotte, which I believe is her ode to her close friend and mentor, Charlotte Fortin Grimke. Charlotte Fortin Grimke, born in 1837, was an African-American abolitionist, poet, writer, and educator, and her entire family was heavily involved in anti-slavery efforts as lecturers, financial contributors, writers, and founders of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. Notably, it was her grandfather, James Fortin, whose financial contributions aided William Lloyd Garrison in founding the Liberator newspaper, and her husband's aunts were abolitionists Sarah and Angelina Grimke. However, Grimke was a famous activist in her own right, contributing pieces to the Liberator, frequently attending anti-slavery lectures, as well as coming to the South to teach newly freed African Americans during the Civil War. Cooper likely met Grimke in 1892, when they both, along with Helen Appo Cook and Mary Church Terrell, helped form the Colored Women's League in Washington, D.C., which is one of the 3 Black women's organizations that later merged into the National Association for Colored Women. After her book on Grimke. And as a side note, the correspondence between Cooper and Du Bois can be found in W.E.B. Du Bois's papers at UMass Amherst. It's a really fascinating exchange between the two as Cooper takes Du Bois to task for his editorial choices at the crisis. But I think, did it stop screen sharing, Dr. Nielsen? Or is that just Ruby? I think it did. It's okay. I'll just keep going.
I lost my connection altogether for a second.
Oh, no worries. It's okay. I can keep going. So.
Well, I should be able to get this back on the screen in just a second if you just hang on here.
Perfect. Great. And from that slide would be perfect. Thank you. But back to Aunt Charlotte. Here you'll see a transcription of Cooper's poem, which exemplifies her determination to honor and memorialize Charlotte Fortin Grimke. The appellation of aunt highlights Grimke as an other mother or intellectual foremother to Cooper's own intellectual and organizational work. The poem recalls the African-American spiritual and hymnal Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, but newly instructs the chariot to, quote, swing lower, way down to the darkest and poorest, end quote, and to, quote, swing lower, my God has not left me unfriended, end quote. The poem does not seem to focus as much on Charlotte Fortin Grimke's personal life per se, but these lines in particular might instead allude to Grimke's work as an educator of newly freed African Americans during and after the Civil War. As evidenced in her diaries, Grimke often instructed African-American children and occasionally African-American adults, and her children would recite hymnals or spirituals to help them learn how to read. Thus, Grimke's efforts to uplift those who were considered, quote, the darkest and the poorest, end quote, and the unfriended were key to her role as an educator and organizer. Furthermore, Cooper writes that, quote, in bondage my mother conceived me, in bondage my first breath I uttered, in bondage my 8 babes I suckled, the bondwoman's prayer, or then muttered, end quote. Once again, Cooper does not make this a poem about Grimke, but instead about the genealogy of Black mothers that they descend from. Charlotte Fortin Grimke was born free, and Cooper was initially born a slave, but freed as a young girl after the Emancipation Proclamation. Cooper never had children, but fostered several, and Grimke had a daughter, but unfortunately her daughter passed away as an infant. Thus, this evocation of motherhood, children, and the bondwoman's prayer signals those Black women who came before them and nurtured them as activists, intellectuals, and other mothers to new generations of Black women. The quote, "Gnarled hands, broken hearts are soon mended, the toil and the ache now are o'er," recognizes the endurance and the strength of the enslaved foremothers and the elder generation of Black women activists who dedicated their lives to nurturing their children and for leaving behind a better world for the Black community. The last stanza represents Cooper's own point of view in respect to this genealogy of Black mothers and other mothers. It reflects Cooper's own perception of following in the footsteps of Aunt Charlotte and her elders, one day being in their same position, having inspired a new generation of Black women, and thus, quote, ready and outside, end quote, to be welcomed by the same chariot. While Cooper did not write an extensive amount of poetry and likely did not consider herself to be a poet, she did see poetry as a useful form to commemorate the important roles Black women played as mothers, other mothers, and intellectuals within Black culture. Her reimagination of visible representations of Simon of Serene and the Black Madonna, as well as her memorializing of Charlotte Fortin Grimke, highlight Cooper's interest in promoting positive Black cultural histories that affirm resistance to oppression, overcoming oppression, and hope for a better future. Cooper's poetry also emphasizes the importance of using creative writing to establish Black genealogies of endurance and faith to inspire and educate the Black community in a moment when Black dignity and Black humanity were being disregarded. Cooper's application of undisputed dignity in her poetry involves reclaiming biblical stories from decades-long justifications for Black enslavement and Black inferiority, and instead utilizes them to assert the dignity and endurance of Black people despite their oppression. Cooper's larger archive reflects her dedication to a principle of undisputed dignity. As a principal, she created pipelines for her Black students to Ivy League schools, asserted their right to higher education. She joined Black women's organizations like the National Association of Colored Women to uplift her community on a larger scale, and she archived and curated the preservation of her work and that of her mentor, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, asserting a Black feminist standpoint of Black women's educational and political engagement. Engaging with Cooper's poetry is one way to recover her lifelong dedication to education and uplift through various generic forms: poetry, essays, speeches, newspaper magazine articles, letters, and organizing. By locating, recovering, sharing, and teaching Cooper's work, we can utilize print and digital archives to recover Cooper's and other 19th century Black women intellectuals who sought to uplift their community and overcame various barriers to ensure that their intellectual and creative work was preserved and taken seriously. Next slide. And I'll kind of end here. Next slide. Okay. I will just go ahead and end by acknowledging the centers, the teams, and the digital projects that supported my research. So I want to shout out the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State, specifically the newly formed Black Women's Organizing Archive. I want to shout out the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University, which digitized Anna Julia Cooper's papers. I want to shout out again Douglas Day 2020 that organized the transcriptions of Cooper's work, as well as the Anna Julia Cooper Digital Project, the In Her Own Right Digital Project, and last but not least, my advisor, Dr. Shirley Mutu-Turner, who continues to inspire and support my work. Thank you, and I will end there, and I look forward to hearing any of y'all's questions.
Okay. Excuse me. If I might address our asynchronous colleagues at the American Literature Association meeting in Boston today in July. Apologies for the occasional technical problems here. Internet connectivity is both a blessing and a curse. I'm sorry that our colleagues meeting in July in Boston can't somehow magically transport their discussion and questions back to us meeting in May as we are. But I do want to encourage them to approach us later on by email or other means with any follow-up that they might in fact have. For today, again, any of the attendees who would like to ask a question, you can click on that Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to start off with maybe, I hope it's not too specific, a question directed to Jean-Philippe. I was really glad that you began by reasserting the importance of Jan-Heinz Jan's work, Muntu and so forth, and his conception of Neo-African culture, partly because it was literally ubiquitous at the time. You know, whether you're studying the poets of the Umbra group then or Nathaniel Mackey now, people really do need to go back and look at that. That said, at the time, Wole Soyinka leveled a devastating criticism at this work, particularly saying that Jan had, you know, truly made entirely too much out of certain syllables of the Bantu language and so forth. No one was using the word essentialism back then, but essentially that's what Soyinka was accusing Jan of having done. And yet Jan's work was, you know, the whole conception of Neo-African culture and this continuity of that he was establishing in the diaspora really took hold among Black writers of all stripes and continued to exercise an influence for a long time. So I'm just wondering, you know, when you're looking at Dent in this regard, what you think, do you think that Jan was successful in trying to establish this continuity without being essentialist? I'm not necessarily asking you to agree with Soyinka or refute Soyinka, but I'm just wondering to what extent you felt that his success might have had to do with his straddling that line.
That's a very good question. Thank you. I'm not going to position myself vis-a-vis the question, but I think one of the reasons why Jan's work was so important, so instrumental to people as different and similar at the same time as Dent and Larry Neal, for instance, was that it articulated, you know, what Lorenzo Thomas was saying about, you know, Umbra and the Black Arts movement, which is this project of reclamation. Right, and that reclamation was firmly anchored by a desire to return to roots, to uncover, you know, the historical beginning, the historical markers of the Black experience, and it's sort of played on two levels at the same time. There's the historiographic need to, you know, to redress, you know, the history that was past, and to then give it sense, probably through the lens of Black Power initiatives. But there's also the music, right? And you see it in the poetry of Umbra and in Amiri Baraka's early in Blues People, for instance, this intimate link between the evolution of the music and socio-historical concerns, right? As if, you know, the music was always a vernacular testament or a vernacularized testament of the experience that was shaping itself and for which there was no history book to speak of. So the history book was the blues songbook. So I think that when Jan talks about the blues and the blues ethos, he not only inspires Dent or Kalamu Ya Salam, but he also gives a sort of conceptual structure to understanding the validity of the music and its potential to continue to articulate the experience of African Americans, especially at the crucial moment, you know, of 66, 67, 68, you know, sort of at the moment where, you know, Knight and say even Sonia Sanchez are questioning the blues, the validity of the blues, and he sort of reactualizes the validity of the blues as a speaking document and a vernacular testament of that experience that is still valid. And Baraka really captures that in his essays and in his poetry when he places, you know, blues as I'm paraphrasing here, but as the racial memory of free jazz, right? So it seems like what Jan is doing, and it's a long-winded answer, but what Jan is doing with Neo-African culture especially is to give a historical foundation upon which the Baraka's generation, Dent's generation, in different ways, will reconceptualize blues as a potent means of expression.
Thank you very much. One thing that's striking in all three of these papers, excuse me, all three of these writers are activists in a very big way. And all three of them are activists in more than one realm, but each of them seems to have a particular realm where they're especially concentrating. In the case of Cooper, it's education. In the case of Toni K Bambara, it's health issues. In the case of Tom Dent, he was actually a literal arts activist, particularly around, you know, organizing theatrical groups and so forth and so on. This clearly is a continuity across the centuries that we're looking at here. And I'm wondering if each of you, maybe starting with Belinda, might reflect for just a moment on how these writers themselves thought of the relationship between their role as writer and their role as activist.
Okay, Aldon, you froze a little bit, but I think the gist of the last part was the role of their role as activist and artist. And many of the interviews Bambara gave, she talks about allowing stories and events to kind of move through her, kind of pass through her, kind of allowing herself to be a vessel for these stories, these histories, these ancestors that really needed to speak through her. And so in many ways, she would move out of the way. She was called to move out of the way and allow those stories to emerge. In other instances, in other interviews that she gave, she talks about herself as an investigative journalist who is recovering, who is searching for these stories, these stories and these histories, trying to recuperate them in some ways. And I agree, Aldon, that each of our papers really speaks to this idea of activism, recuperation, reclamation. So she found herself over the course of her life working in that way as this investigative journalist and this writer. What's most striking for me, and I'll not take up too much time to give JP and Sabrina time to respond as well. What's most striking to me is the relevance of her work even now. So as someone who lives right outside of Philadelphia, like a stone's throw outside, and who spent much of my formative years in Philadelphia, I am very aware of the history of MOVE, the bombing that occurred there, and Bambara's not just awareness, but her really her taking that atrocity, that horrendous act of violence that was enacted on a Black community, not just that community that was located there, but like the broader Philadelphia community, taking that in and really speaking to that through her documentary film was so powerful when she worked on it. But it's even more powerful now when we learn of the remains of the two children that have been kept at University of Pennsylvania, and the negotiation to move their remains to Princeton in order for researchers there to use them for their own scholarship and I guess the greater good. Her work as an activist, her situating the bombing and that community, that smaller community as really significant to the larger health and wellness of the larger Philadelphia community and the national national and global Black community is something that I'm just really struck by. And I'm losing my words here a little bit, but her role as an activist, again, allowing stories and ancestors to speak through her and moving out of the way to do so, but also taking on the investigative role to uncover details and details and information that was not necessarily known to the public. In the example of the Atlanta murders, and then taking the atrocities and really documenting them so that we have that, as Sabrina noted, the living archive, right? We have a living archive of what happened there. And so that's how Bambara, I believe, I believe that's her role as activist and artist.
Why don't you go, Sabrina? I spoke for a long time before, so I'll go last.
Yes. So I think Anna Julia Cooper, like one of her major roles as an activist was as an educator, with advocating both for her students at Dunbar High School, but also for adults seeking education, like after work, like she had an adult school. But I think, but outside of education, she was heavily involved in the Black Women's Club movement of the 1890s and early 1900s. And she was really interested in like serving this role of like advocating for those that did not have a voice, whether it would be, as I mentioned before, writing to W. Du Bois and being like, Charlotte Fortin Grimke should have a section in the crisis, like we should do a spread on her, or for her to say, you're holding these, kind of when he was organizing the Pan-African conferences, she's like, well, why are you having it now when I'm teaching? Like, as a teacher, I won't be able to go. Like, she would send him letters to be like, why are you making this inconvenient? So she was really not afraid to kind of speak out and advocate for others. And I think another aspect of her activism was really as an archivist herself. If you look at her archive at Howard, she has a couple of scrapbooks where she would cut out her newspaper articles and paste them in these scrapbooks. And then she would write, like if they misspelled her name or they forgot to put doctor in front of Anna Julia Cooper, she would pencil it in. So I think, as well as like with her, after not being able to get a book published about Charlotte Fortin Grimke, she ended up independently publishing it. So she was really interested in not only kind of advocating in terms of education and participating in kind of the Black Club Women's movement, but also being an archivist herself and like preserving her own work and that of the women that she was in community with, which I found really fascinating.
Yeah, I think for Tom Dent, I go back to one of the first orientation, that the editors of Umbra had in their sort of statement in Umbra 1, which is, that the literature should reflect the experience of African Americans in the U.S. And I think that Dent, even though I see Dent's activism as being inextricably linked with his ability to give voices to emerging writers and to use those venues to continue to express the multifaceted experiences that African Americans have lived. And I mean, if you think about Umbra and Combo, Callaloo, to me, giving us a space for literary voices to appear, giving an artistic and educational platform. If you think about the Congo Square Writers Union, is Dent's legacy, and his activism. His activism was both literary, right, giving voices to young Black writers at a time where the dissemination of Black voices was complex, and at the same time organizing, grassroots or mobilizing grassroots organizations. Free Southern Theater is one, Congo Square Writers is another, and mobilizing them as a way that will inspire the next generation, right? Like the Kalamu Ya Salam, to continue in the footsteps. To me, that's really a kind of passage of an activist mindset that is geared towards illuminating and voices and granting them opportunities to express themselves.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Jeff Westover. He says, all of your presentations seem to touch on redemption or renewal and healing of some kind. Would Belinda please talk about the role of Loas, I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, in Salt Eaters in promoting community wellness? Perhaps Sabrina would talk more about Cooper's use of Christianity to promote healing in her poems. I know she did this explicitly, but does Sabrina see a parallel between Cooper's redemptive work with the writers discussed by her co-panelists? Whichever one of you wants to begin.
Sabrina, do you want to go first, or?
I could go if you'd like. Let's see. I think that I guess you kind of made part of the connection that I would make between kind of Cooper's use of poetry or Christianity in her poems to promote this notion of healing and to give her students the opportunity to see themselves in these biblical stories in ways that they might not otherwise. And I think like even today, like when I read that New York Times article about the Black Madonna, them deciding they want to clean it of the soot of like, what does it mean for this kind of Black cultural history to be erased in that sense, and like there being no attention to it. Like, what does it mean that like Cooper viewed this this kind of sculpture back then, but we're no longer able to access that, and now all that remains of it is in her poetry. But I think in thinking about the redemptive work, I think we see that I'll particularly kind of speak to the Salt Eaters and with Toni K Bambara, who I think both her and Cooper were really interested in thinking about Black women's kind of health and Black women's like preserving their intellectual thought as a form of kind of health where they were disregarded in many other spaces. But yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think I see, to me, a genealogy that extends from Cooper and many of the other Black women, her Black women contemporaries like Mary Church Terrell, like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, like Ida B. Wells. I see that genealogy descending into the work that Toni K Bambara does in her literature as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you for the question. One of the things that I'll say here is the Bambara's insistence on emphasizing the way that healing is not always, again, is not always related to allopathic medicine. It's not always related to modern medicine. And so in putting that up front, that the healing ceremony that we're witnessing in the Salt Eaters is less about allopathic medicine and more about the quote unquote non-traditional healing practices. We are ushered into a space via music, via touch, via community that is not primarily medical personnel, physicians, and other healthcare providers, but that is primarily a healer who is very much connected to spiritual ancestors and in different healing practices, surrounded by a community of believers in Minnie's practice and advisors for that. And then beyond, like right beyond that, if we think about it, a circle, and right beyond them, community members being there as part of the healing center. If we think about that as the bare structure of what healing what constitutes healing within a Black community, we can then move inward to the type of healing that is required for someone like Velma, who again has a spiritual inheritance. And so your question is really gets at this idea of what happens when someone who carries a spiritual inheritance is, number one, in denial of it, who is running away from it. We see throughout the novel how she is rejecting and turning away from what Bambara calls her mud mothers, who seem to be calling to her throughout the novel. There's a rejection of that, and that really catapults her into a worsened mental state, because again, what wholeness looks like for her is a connection to her her ancestors, is a connection to a rootedness that has nothing to do with what we understand in our postmodern, if you will, what we understand as traditional or acceptable, right? But what Bambara tries to do is to present that spiritual inheritance, present other types of knowing, other types of healing that Minnie embodies and is trying to bring out of Velma. She positions that as normal. She positions that again as a cultural necessity. And in many ways, I'm going back to one of the things that JP said, and forgive me, I'm just kind of scrolling through this recuperative process, this reinscription of a practice that Velma is her legacy. It is her inheritance. I hope that answers the question. But the main point I really want to make here is the normalization of other ways of knowing and healing and spiritual inheritances, the normalization of that, right? And the making allopathic medicine, physicians and healthcare practitioners and medical facilities, allowing that to kind of be the backdrop, not the primary source of knowledge and wisdom about our bodies. It plays a role in it. I don't want to act like, it's just not supposed to be there. And Bambara doesn't either. It certainly plays a role in it, but there is another component that for some individuals is really the primary component to their healing.
Thank you.
Well, one advantage we have of being a virtual session is we don't have the panelists from the next session coming through the door to kick us out of the room. Before we go, I'm wondering if any of the panelists had responses or questions they would like to direct to one another.
Even though I just spoke, I just want to jump in. This isn't a question. This is just heaping praise on JP and Sabrina, again, for their brilliant work and the ways in which they both highlighted how recuperation, how preservation is so necessary to not just our literatures and arts, but our history as well, our shared history. And so I'm just so appreciative to sit with you all, and I am inspired to jump back into my own work, which has been sitting on the side. I'm so inspired to jump back into that. And I hope that for those who have joined and for those who will watch our panel, that the work that has been presented here will also be an inspiration to jump back into those recuperative practices that you might be working with. So thank you, JP and Sabrina.
I want to join in that, thanks. And again, addressing our our asynchronous future colleagues in July. The African American Literature and Culture Society, for those of you who don't know it, is unlike the other author societies in the ALA in that we have multiple panels. We don't just have the two that most author societies get. So keep an eye out for our calls for papers. We really do want to hear from you. Do join the organization. We hope to see all of you in Chicago next year. at our reception, and we look forward to seeing your submissions for the panels that we'll be putting on there. So again, thanks to all of our panelists for doing such great work, and see everyone in Chicago next year. Bye-bye.